here we go, guys. Here we go. This is Daniel. He's back. And we are going to be talking about sleep and performance in esports. Here's our beautiful little presentation that I'm going to be setting up for you guys, as you guys will see. And here, boom. So here it is. So Daniel can go ahead and take it away.
Okay, here we go. So, welcome everyone, I suppose. Listen, it's really good to do this. I love talking about sleep, and me and Matt have done quite a few things at this point, and he's a great co-facilitator, so I'm really happy that we can do it together as well. Let's just jump into it, Matt. What do you reckon?
Yeah, let's go.
So the first thing to be aware of, and I always sort of like to sort of make people aware of this, if you just jump to the next slide, sorry, Matt, is that sleep management has become massive in the sporting world, probably in about the last 5 or 6 years. So in traditional sort of sporting teams, most major organisations do have sleep management programs, and esports has started to kind of catch up. So a couple of years ago, when I first started getting into this area, there was nothing sort of happening, and then about 3 years ago we started working with some teams, and this is just a few of the teams that we've actually been lucky enough, or players that I suppose play for these teams, that we've been lucky enough to work with, and there's a bit of a spread. There's been obviously some really big teams that have kind of jumped on board this sort of stuff, and then there's been some smaller teams as well. So I think you're sort of starting to see around the whole area that people are starting to sort of, I suppose, sit up and take notice and really looking into how they can actually help their players with their sleep health, and doing the right things for their players by providing appropriate services. So it's exciting. I'm really happy that this is starting to happen. So this is what we'll be covering today. We'll be talking about sort of the basic processes around sleep and what happens during sleep, how much you need, defining normal sleep, and then at the end talking a bit about what you can actually do to try and improve your sleep as well. All right, so first thing, and I always like to sort of chuck a question out there for people who are kind of, I suppose, listening to this sort of presentation. Why do people think sleep's important? Just chuck out a few answers.
Go ahead, guys. Don't be afraid. Why is sleep important? That is the question. And I should have cued some music that would allow thinking to happen, just like my content. But we'll
thinking music, yeah.
We'll let the questions roll in. Why do you guys think sleep is important?
Like, what does it do? What's the function of sleep? Yeah. So we spend a huge amount of our lives doing it. Like, why? Like, what's the reason for that?
So we have
this. I'll just sort of draw.
They said,
what's coming through?
To rest the brain, better alertness, and body. To rest the brain and body, and we have better alertness. And yeah. So there are, and this, I always like to sort of include this quote actually from this guy, Alan. I can't actually pronounce his last name, but Alan. So he was a really famous sleep researcher from quite a few decades ago. And he was quite famous for saying that, sleep would have been a huge evolutionary mistake if it didn't serve a really, really critical function in terms of sustaining life. Because if you think about it, when we're asleep, we are totally vulnerable. And evolutionarily speaking, I mean, that presents a bit of a problem, doesn't it? If you sort of think about you're vulnerable to predators. So we wouldn't do it unless it was really important. And you can break it down. So it's important for your physical health and your mental health, and also physical performance as well. So, for example, from a mental health perspective, insomnia, which is a sleep disorder that some of you guys might know about, is considered to be like the canary in the coal mine when it comes to depression, for example. So it's a really big risk factor. So there's more and more responses now. Of course, the theme is everyone's saying recovery. Definitely, sleep is important because the brain makes connections when asleep. Alertness, you said, to recovery and to learn well or learn good, and everyone just clapping the head choppers because he says because the brain makes connections when asleep, and that's true. That's very true. So
all right.
What about the questions here too? If I just show you, can you see that?
They're a bit small for me. I think I can't quite see them.
Yeah. Okay.
Next slide, yeah. So there are two processes that determine when we go to sleep and when we wake up. And the first one's called your sleep drive, and it works like the hunger mechanism, right? So when you wake up in the morning, if you can just point to that bit just on the left there, Matt, where you wake up in the morning. As soon as you wake up in the morning, your sleep pressure starts to build up, okay, across the day. So that corresponds to a inhibitory neurotransmitter called adenosine. So it's a sleep chemical that builds up in the brain, and it makes you sleepier and sleepier and sleepier. And then when you actually go to sleep at night, it decreases, right? So it's like a wave. So like it's, the longer that you go without sleep, the sleepier you get. The longer that you go without eating, the hungrier you get as well. Now, but what you can see is that if you don't go to sleep, your sleep pressure just continues to build, right? And this is one of the problems that people can experience when they don't get enough sleep, is that their sleep pressure is constantly a bit high, and they start to really feel the effects of that. All right, next one. So the other process is called your body clock, which creates what we call your circadian rhythm. Okay, so this is really interesting, I think, because of the conflict that can sometimes happen between your body clock and your competition timing, right? So your body clock sets the timing of your sleep. So this is the rhythm. Now, this is for an average person, I should say as well. This is not for a lot of the players that I work with have a very, what we call, delayed body clock. So everything happens later. So this is for an average person. But what you can sort of see, if you sort of look down the bottom, so you've got time across the bottom. So you've got lunchtime over on the left, and then it goes across there back to lunchtime again. And then you've got alertness going up and then sleepiness going down. So between about 2 and 4 o'clock in the afternoon, if you can just point that one out, thanks, Matt, that is what we call your post-lunch dip, right? This is where you naturally feel more sleepy. So this, for the average person who goes to sleep about, let's say, 10:30, 11 and wakes up about 7, it happens between about 2 and 4 o'clock in the afternoon. And then what happens is that you have your evening peak, right, which happens about 7 p.m. This is where people feel really, really good and really alert. And then it rapidly starts to decline, all right? And this corresponds with your sleep drive, like we just talked about. So people get sleepier and then they fall asleep. If you can see the bar down the bottom, that indicates that someone is asleep. Now, you don't notice this, right? But you actually have your low point about 5 a.m. in the morning. This is for an average person, once again. So this, like I said, you don't notice it because you're asleep. But if you are awake, right, then biologically you're at your worst, okay? So your reaction speed's slow, your processing speed's slow. So they've done research where they've actually looked at car crash data and they have overlapped it, and they see a spike in car crashes, which happens at the exact same time that you see that dip in your alertness levels, okay? And then, yeah, exactly. And then what happens after that? Your alertness levels start to increase, you wake up for the day, and then the rhythm continues. And it happens every single day. So the problem, though, for some people is that this rhythm just happens way, way later. And sometimes that can conflict with competition times, right? So this is probably one of the most common problems that I come across when I work with people in esports. So, someone might say, well, like for a Rocket League team that I work with at the moment, they have to be up at 9 o'clock to play their first match in the next regional. But a couple of them actually don't wake up. Yeah, thanks, man. That's great. A couple of them don't wake up until naturally about 10:30, 11. So they have to be up 2 hours earlier than they normally would be, which literally directly conflicts with that low point. So they're performing and they're competing at a time when their body's kind of saying, you really shouldn't be doing this. You should be asleep. So we actually have to try and move their rhythm earlier away from their competition time. I'll stop there because I think that's, like I said, this is highly relevant for so many players that I work with. Can anybody relate to that? Can anybody sort of, I suppose, relate to the idea like, I need to compete at a time that I'm just feeling so sleepy because I had to get up much earlier than I usually would?
We definitely have some questions, and we're going to be getting to those, guys. Let me see. Maybe we can get to that while the responses come in.
Sure. Actually, Matt, how much of a, like I said, this is a common problem for players I work with. What about players you work with? I mean, do you see this as well?
Oh, definitely, right. And of course, it varies depending on the esports title, right? When people scrim is different for League of Legends, is different for Fortnite, is different for Counter-Strike, is different for Valorant or Overwatch League. Every esports title has a different competitive schedule, right? But that doesn't mean that everyone has the same or adjust their sleeping schedule around that scrim time. In fact, most of the time it's pretty standard in that, hey, they sleep later and they wake up later and they have this delay what's on the screen of sleeping, which means that they might not be at the optimal level of alertness when they need to be, right?
That's right, exactly.
Instead of 7, right, we have a competition that's at 4, that they're going to be in this little dip, right? They might be just beginning the dip, right? If you guys see that. Whereas if you wake up and set your body clock at a normal time, it's going to be in a more optimal level for yourself to have this peak level of alertness, which is why it's so important to understand this concept of the body clock. And I'm so glad, right?
Massively.
This is one of the first things that we're talking about. So everyone is saying yes. Someone's asking, what about naps?
Naps. We'll talk about naps. I mean, naps can actually be helpful in terms of increasing alertness and performance temporarily, but they'll never replace good quality sleep during the night. But they can be useful for some people in some circumstances, for sure.
Got it. So there's definitely a lot of really thoughtful questions that we're going to be able to get to.
Great. That's fantastic.
A lot of people are in a night schedule as they wake up around 12 a.m. and play into the night like 4 a.m. Exactly. Yeah. People are on a flipped and reversed schedule. And that can affect when competition time comes by, right? What if they haven't transitioned their body clock? So,
and the thing is that for people who have like late schedules, but then they have late matches and late scrims, I mean, that's fine. It actually doesn't matter because their body clock lines up with their training and competition times. But then, of course, sometimes competitions can be earlier, and that's when people get caught out, is when they can't adjust, as quickly as they need to the new competition time.
Yeah. So we have quite a few great questions from someone I'm working with right now, Reed, about circadian-induced jet lag. What we also call social jet lag. We'll talk a little bit about that later on, and Daniel will get into some of the depth about that. But he also asks, about those, sunrise clocks. Do they actually help?
Yeah. But actually, we'll come back to that actually at the end. I think when we talk about intervention things, that'll make more sense. So hold that question, dude, because that's a good question. Now, this is what actually happens when you are asleep. So this is what we call your sleep architecture. So the different stages of sleep that people actually go through when they're asleep. So on the left, right, you've got what we call your REM sleep, which is also called your dreaming sleep. And then we've got the different other stages of sleep. So stage 1, 2, and 3. Now, this is an old pictogram. Technically speaking, now stage 4 doesn't exist. They've actually merged stage 3 and stage 4. But this is just an old pictogram. But essentially what happens is you start awake and then you zip down into deep sleep quite quickly. And then you spend a chunk of time down in deep sleep and then you actually move back up and you have your first bit of REM sleep. So we call this a sleep cycle. And this is what you do throughout the entire night. You literally go down and up for the entire night. Now, you can notice a few different things on this graph that I kind of just want to point out. One is that you get almost all of your deep sleep in the first 4 hours of being asleep, and you get most of your REM sleep in the second half of the sleep period. And the last thing I would mention is that it's actually normal to wake up during the night as well, but you just don't want to spend too long awake. That's when it becomes a problem for some people, is that when those awakenings actually start to get longer and longer and longer. But waking up is completely normal. Now, I always like to ask this question, just for a bit of fun, but can anybody think of why we've been hardwired to wake up during the night. Like, it's literally like often people don't remember it because it's so brief, but everyone wakes up during the night. And the question is why?
So one of our viewers is going to sleep, and then one of the other viewers with a very clever comment says, Dr. Bonnar is so good at his job, he's putting Becker to sleep. That's clever. That's great. And there are questions about, like, can you change your body clock? Is it affected by sunlight? What we're doing right now is establishing the base of what you guys need to know about sleep and the architecture of sleep, so that all the questions that you guys are asking will make more sense, so we can reference it. Hey, remember the stages, remember your rhythm, remember your body clock, remember your sleep pressure. So what Head Choppers says, to kill the lions, to kill those MF lions, to check your surroundings. Another great response.
That's the one.
Yep.
Who was that? That's the winner.
Oh, wait. We have NXM, the winner. Ding, ding, ding. To check your surroundings.
So they're sentry points, yeah. So people naturally, if anything's going on around you, you actually know what's going on, and you could, I suppose, presumably escape from whatever's roaming around.
There we go. I drew an eye so everyone knows. All right. Next slide. Got it.
Now, how much, actually go back, sorry, Matt, how much sleep does everyone think they need? That's a good question before you see that next one. Because what's the age range, Matt, of the people listening today?
Well, we can ask, how old are you guys? If you guys don't mind putting your age in the chat, or if you guys don't want to provide specifics, just put the decade. I'm in my 20s, I'm in my 30s. Just let us know.
Yeah.
And then we can...
And then also put in how much sleep you think you need personally.
Yeah.
Or how much sleep you think someone your age needs, yeah.
Ooh, okay. We got some good responses. We have 10 hours, 7 to 8 hours. 15 is guessing 8 to 9. One person says 9. We have 19, 18, 21, 20. All between like 15 to mid-20s, it seems.
Yeah, sure.
We have Nim, who sleeps 10 to 11 hours. Mid-20s,
a bit of a lot.
8 hours.
Yep. So let's jump to the slide. So for a teenager, the recommended average is about 8 to 10 hours. For an adult 18 plus, it's about 7 to 9. So it doesn't mean that anything between, for example, for an adult 7 to 9 is going to be sufficient. Everyone's different, right? So we all need a different amount of sleep. It's just that most people need somewhere between 7 and 9 for an adult, for example, or 8 to 10 for a teen. So, for example, I'm about an 8 to an 8.5 hours sleeper. Matt, what about you? How much sleep do you think you need on average?
Well, let's see. According to my data, so I use the Oura Ring and I track my sleep, and I keep a mental log of how I feel throughout the day. And typically, when I feel at my best, I'm getting about 7.5 hours. That's how I feel.
Yeah, about 7.5. Yeah. So that sort of does the trick for you. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So everyone's a bit different, right? And the only thing that you need to be aware of as an individual is like making sure that you actually meet your sleep needs. So as long as you're getting enough for you personally, then that's all that matters. Keep in mind, some people need more and some people need less. So I think you said there was someone that said needs about 10 to 11. So so that person's a bit of a longer sleeper probably. Some people I work with...
If you don't mind.
What's that?
He says, why do you need less sleep when you're 65 and older and dying? He says, this guy says that.
Well, it's a good question. So you don't actually, so as you can see, right, you get less sleep across the lifespan. That's actually a good point to make. Now you don't actually need less sleep, but you just get less sleep, right? Because your sleep becomes more fractured and shallow as you get older. It's just one of the side effects of aging, unfortunately. Mm-hmm. You can't stop it from happening. It just happens. So that's why people do get less sleep when they do sort of get into that older adulthood kind of stage of life. Yeah.
Got it.
Now, what's the next slide? I think it's putting it all together, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah. So this is what normal sleep should be when we put kind of all this information together, right? That it takes about 30 minutes or less to get to sleep, 30 minutes or less spent awake during the night, your sleep duration meets your sleep needs. So you're getting enough sleep for your individual needs. The timing of your sleep pattern doesn't interfere with daily tasks. And it's actually common to feel sleepy and feel tired for about 30 minutes after, or up to 30 minutes after you wake up. And it's called sleep inertia. Does that surprise anybody? Like, I've actually had quite a few people sort of say, like, oh, that's weird. That's like not my sleep at all, or something like that. Does that surprise anyone at all listening to that?
And interestingly enough, Reed, one of the viewers, has mentioned, maybe a statistic that was out there somewhere about Kobe needing 5 and LeBron 12 hours of sleep on average. Although, who knows, how true that is. I would definitely love to understand where the statistic on Kobe came from, because, with the high amount of stress and the high amount of physical exertion throughout the day, naturally our body makes adaptations in sleep architecture, or at least that's my understanding. Is that correct, Daniel? Right, like as we do more, don't we have changes in our duration of deep sleep to REM sleep, depending on our activity?
There can certainly be changes, for sure. So what was anyone surprised by this kind of description of normal sleep, Matt?
One person says sleep inertia is way longer than 30. One says I wake up broken. One says I thought I was weird for feeling super tired after waking up. That's why it's really good to actually make the point about sleep inertia, because some people sort of feel like, oh, I should jump out of bed feeling like, fresh as, and I mean it's pretty rare to jump out of bed just going, yep, great, instantly I just feel great. You're transitioning from being asleep to being awake. There's going to be a period of time there where your body is kind of catching up with the fact that you've just woken up. So someone said sleep inertia can last longer than that. That can possibly be somebody who maybe isn't getting enough sleep. So maybe there is there's like a bit of a hangover effect there, where there's like some sleep debt. About 40 minutes is as long as it gets. I mean, I've said 30 there. That's probably average, but 40 minutes, it wouldn't probably be much longer than that. So there's a few other comments here. Kind of true. I usually think it's because I need to go back to sleep. That's one. And someone else also says, why, if I go to bed really late, I always get up around 7 a.m., 8 a.m., even if I only get 5 hours of sleep. That's a good question. Probably just the body clock. So your body clock and your sleep drive work together. So even if sometimes, I think most people can relate to the idea of like, oh, I went out and had a big night, and I got home really late, and then I still woke up really early, even though I wanted to sleep in. And that's probably just the body clock saying, this is the time that your body clock's really powerful. So it just wakes you up anyway, not too late. And then when I was younger, I felt wide awake when I woke up. But nowadays, I feel knocked out even when I get the same amount of sleep.
Yep. Now, what's the next one? Right. This is some interesting. This is like research that we just did literally. So I've been doing some research in esports and sleep for the last couple of years, and these are two studies that we published really recently. So on the left, we've got one with 17 pros from Australia, South Korea, and the US, and this was using sleep tracking devices, so an objective measure of sleep. And the average amount of sleep that participants got in the study was 6.8 hours. The sleep timing was really late, like even compared to people of their same age, was 3:41 to 11:11. The South Koreans were particularly late. US was slightly earlier, and Australians were somewhere in the middle. Night wakefulness was about 51 minutes, which was quite high. And really interestingly, 50% of players reported poor sleep pre-competition, which kind of suggested that they were thinking about the match the next day, and were worried, and that was the thing that was keeping them awake. And then mood was really impacted by poor sleep as well. And then another one just with pros from South Korea. So this was using subjective sleep measures, this one. Sleep duration was 7.16 So it was within the recommended 7 to 9, but really on the low end. So most of the players would not have been getting how much sleep they need for their individual need. And you can see the sleep timing. I mean, these guys train for these guys did train for 13 hours a day, by the way, the South Koreans. They, they're they're something else. They're just crazy. So one of the things that we actually found was that the prac times pushed sleep timing later for a lot of players. And I wonder if that's the experience of people listening today as well. And there were really high depression scores as well in the South Koreans. And we kind of speculated that maybe they were overtraining. And sleepiness scores were really, really high as well. So what does everyone think about this data? Does this reflect anyone's kind of, I suppose, thoughts about sleep in esports? What does everyone think?
We have one comment.
What are your thoughts about this, Matt?
Says, this tells us that even with bad sleep, you can be a pro, right? And I think it's really important to highlight, right, that, hey, they are getting to this professional level, maybe not having the best or optimized sleep habits. But I would also ask you to think, what happens if they did? What if they did have better sleep habits? How much better would they be? Might they be? Yeah. And will their depression scores, sleepiness scores, sleep pre-competition be the same? So I'll give the heads up because I didn't include it in this presentation, but we actually did an intervention with players and we're still looking at still writing it up to publish it. But we did an intervention with pros from Australia, the US, and South Korea. And the initial kind of findings from some of the teams that we worked with was that their sleep improved and their performance on cognitive measures improved as well, and mood improved. So we actually found improvements because their sleep improved. So their reaction time, for example, was faster at the end of the intervention compared to pre-intervention. Surprise, surprise, eh? Right? Surprise, surprise. Or
so that's some early findings. You'll be able to see hopefully the publication when it comes out in a couple of months. Right, next slide, I reckon. Oh, actually, go away from this one, Matt. Go back.
Oh, okay.
How does everyone think that esports performance can be impacted by sleep loss? Don't look at that next slide. Sorry, Matt. What does everyone think? Like, based on their own experiences or just thinking about what they know about sleep and performance, how do they think that esports performance is impacted by sleep loss?
So we have also an interesting point too. Someone says that tell that to people with the depression scores sleeping 12 hours a day, right? And that's an interesting point to discuss, I think.
Yeah. No, some people, when it comes to sleep and depression, right? So depression can go kind of either way, right? So sometimes people sleep less, sometimes they oversleep and they sleep more. So it's basically, it can be a deviation from the norm is kind of the way to think about it. So what did everyone write, Matt, about?
Well, we're seeing slower processing is one. I think
definitely.
One of the guys has really quick eyes, so he saw something. But
did you?
We'll see. So definitely slower processing is one of the responses.
Yeah, sure.
I think for me, even anecdotally from when I work and talk to players on a weekly basis, anytime that they report getting less sleep, there's always individual and then team-wide impact on how they perform. So, we can discuss a little bit about why it can even be helpful, in a team-wide environment, and for organizations to really realize, hey, we can create this culture of how do we help this individual, but how does it help the entire team? That's a really big narrative that we want organizations. For Team Liquid, that's definitely in here watching this, for C9 and all the big orgs. I know you guys are watching this. We're that popular. That's a really important narrative to understand. So, personally impacts decision-making more so than reflexes, at least in the first day or two. Running on 5 hours for more than 2 days, everything gets hard, and it gets hard fast.
Really
people
fast,
with less sleep would rage at teammates, absolutely.
They do. Yeah, that's something that I've wanted to look into more, like from an actual formal research perspective. That's a really good point. The things to be aware of, right, is that when you look at the impact of sleep loss on performance, you can think about it in two ways. You can look at physical performance, and then you can look at cognitive performance. So when it comes to physical performance, sleep has a differential impact. So there are some elements of physical performance that are impacted, and then there are some elements of physical performance that aren't impacted. But when it comes to cognitive performance, almost globally, cognitive performance is impacted, right? And esports performance is so strongly related to, or is dependent on cognitive performance. So let's check it out. Now, these are, I should say as well, these are just some of the examples of how sleep loss can impact esports performance. So this is not an exhaustive list by any means. But slow reaction speed is probably one of the most common ones that we kind of see. Like there's a really, really strong finding in the literature about that. Increased errors due to time pressure. So this is, if you think about Counter-Strike, for example, it's just the classic idea of time pressure, isn't it? Yeah. So poor tactical awareness, individually and within a team as well. So, so many esports are team-based, aren't they?
Yep.
People find it harder to adapt, so they actually continue with ineffective strategies for longer. I think someone mentioned earlier about learning and memory, so it is harder to learn new strategies as well. People fatigue quicker, and the longer that people play for, the more decision errors that they make as well. So, like I said, a non-exhaustive list, but just some of the ways that people can be impacted by sleep loss in esports. So you can see, it has a really global impact.
It's so clear, right, how it can affect you on a micro and macro level, with just these things. And like Daniel said, it's not exhaustive. There's a lot more that we can probably speak to, even, on the physical end. But definitely with that global effect on the cognitive end, it's going to be affecting you. And, it might create frustrations that, can even affect things like motivation, right? Which is, I think, pretty common.
Yep.
When you don't see yourself making progress, and maybe don't realize how important sleep is, what are you going to blame? Maybe, I'm just not getting better, right? I'm not good. But if we kind of zoom out and identify, hey, well, your sleep can lead to a bunch of these things, that can help you realize, what changes you actually need to make with regards to your lifestyle so you can perform better. But what are your guys' thoughts on this? How many times have these things happened to you guys?
And actually, the person that mentioned about raging at teammates and stuff, I think that's a really interesting point, right? So your ability to regulate emotions is definitely impaired with sleep loss. And people's tolerance for like irritants and frustrations is lower as well. So let's say, you've got a teammate and they do something that you don't like or you don't agree with, or they make a mistake. And normally you might be able to sort of just brush it off and, be supportive and walk past it. People are much more likely to kind of react to that. And then, of course, that can lead to interpersonal problems between teammates as well. So, I think that was a really excellent point that person said.
I also think this is a really good point of discussion too. So Reed says, he sees a boost in his performance when running on low sleep, right? And I know you have a study where you kind of talked about that. So Reed, we're going to get to that because you will realize what's happening there with perception maybe. It's in the next slide, right?
It is. It's funny when with some of the South Korean players that we had participate in our study. Some of them said the same thing. They had this kind of belief that actually I perform better with less sleep, and of course, that kind of runs counter to the literature.
And this is so common, right? I feel like every single person that I've talked to in esports has such a firm belief in this idea that, wow, if I feel like I do better when I sleep less, and it's just very consistent. Sorry I interrupted, but
no. Well, let's jump to the next one. It does talk about it. So this study, I always like to include it because it was a landmark study. It was massive when it came out, and it people still to this day cite it in their research. It's extremely widely cited. So what this group did if you can just point to it, Matt, but they had different sleep doses that they gave to people. So they had an 8-hour group, which is the green, and then they had a 6-hour group, the yellow, and then a 4-hour group. And then they actually had a group that they gave no sleep to over 3 days. So the other groups were over a 2-week period. So they were only allowed to have that much sleep each night. And then up the side, we have performance lapses. So they actually measured cognitive performance as well. And this was just one of the metrics, which is lapses. So like making errors.
Can you clarify that a little bit for people that might not understand what performance or cognitive lapses might be?
Yeah. So for example, this was a reaction time test, and so with the reaction time test, you can make errors when you're doing it. So you can like false start, or you're too slow to react. So those errors start to increase over time. So what they found, right? You can see. I mean, it's crystal clear, right? So with the 8-hour group, there was no significant difference anyway between day 0 and day 14. But for the other groups, cognitive lapses or performance lapses increased, and they accumulated over time. So they got worse and worse and worse over the 2-week period. And one of the really interesting findings was that over 2 weeks, the 6-hour sleep group was actually performing at the same level as the group that had 2 days total sleep deprivation. Now, when I first read that blew my mind. I was like, wow, like who would have thought that 6 hours? And some people say, 6 hours, that's what I get, or that's enough, or whatever. For this study, when they averaged everything out, was the same as 2 days of total sleep deprivation. So, I found that super interesting. And the other thing as well was that they actually asked participants, were they performing worse? And a lot of participants actually said, no, they didn't think they were. So people didn't necessarily recognize that they were performing worse, even though obviously they were increasingly performing worse over the 2-week period. So I just find this study, extremely interesting. And it's just indicative, I suppose, of what the literature shows, which is that, sleep loss and sleep debt, the deficits that come from that accumulate over time. So it kind of runs counter to that idea that people perform better when they sleep less.
Yep. Yeah, we'll let that sink in a little bit, because someone actually mentioned, right? He said, I think Gervin did say that, when you're tired, you think you're doing well, but you're not really, right? And it does, right? I mean, if you are cognitively impaired even a little bit, do you think you have a good awareness or evaluation of your own level of performance? It might not be as accurate, right, as maybe a full 8 hours of sleep. So just keep that in mind, right?
It's like, it's like having a few beers, right? And then going, no, like I'm still performing when I'm like the same as when I'm sober.
Exactly.
Right. But if we tested you,
yeah,
you wouldn't be, right?
Right.
So, sometimes I actually say to players, you wouldn't play drunk, right? So why would you play sleep deprived? Because it's basically the same thing. So that's something often I might sort of say to players. What about the next one?
Yeah.
Oh, right. So risk factors. So this is a paper that we first wrote. So this was the first ever paper in sleep in esports. And what we did was we identified all these different risk factors for poor sleep in esports. And I thought I've just highlighted just a couple that we'll sort of go through in a bit more detail. So pre-comp worry, caffeine, tech, and social jet lag. It's not that they're the most important. It's just that I think maybe they're the most relevant, perhaps. The ones that people might be most interested in anyway.
Yep.
So the first one is the caffeine. Caffeine. So this is really interesting. When I first started researching in esports a couple of years ago, I assumed, and you shouldn't assume anything as a researcher, of course, but I assumed that esports players would be consuming massive amounts of caffeine. And then with the Australian and the Korean participants, that didn't actually seem to be the case. People were like, we don't consume that much, which shocked me. And then Matt, of course, doing a bit of work with more US players, and it actually seems like maybe caffeine consumption is higher in the US, and particularly amongst certain games over other games.
Exactly.
Can we just put a question out to the audience about, I suppose, how much caffeine they consume? Like, so one cup of coffee, if you just use as an average of 100 milligrams, a can of like Monster might be like 150 milligrams for a 500 ml can. How much is everyone consuming?
And also really let us know where you're from, right? Because it is an idea of mine, and who knows how much this is contributing to it, right? But our exposure in the US to marketing of caffeine and marketing of energy products is probably higher, I think, than places like Asia or certain places in Europe. So let us know where you're from, general region, and how many milligrams on average of caffeine that you guys take, because we can maybe draw some early connections, and maybe it is consistent with what we've seen, right? Because Daniel and I started. We talked to a Call of Duty team, and they on average take a lot more than quite a few of the other teams that we work with, whether it be League of Legends, even Fortnite or Overwatch. It's surprising the difference in dosages that people take. So we have a few responses here. We have 1, 0, none. Water only, baby. There it is. I love that. 300 milligrams a day, and he's in the US. We have United Kingdom, Nathan, and he doesn't drink coffee. So in the UK, we have France, does not drink any. We have Ralix from Denmark, who I don't believe he told us. We have one person from Sweden who consumes half a Monster usually, so 75 milligrams. We have someone from Belgium. We have 150 milligrams. I'm not sure where STX is from. Water and milk only from Sweden. US, no caffeine. Great. Water and juice. 0, but US, but caffeine only makes me urinate more. Doesn't wake me up at all.
Yeah, it does. Diuretic.
Yeah, it is a diuretic. And then Paranoid, I used to pop a can a day, and he's from Canada. Okay.
Yeah, that's actually, so I mean, like, I suppose that, like, those numbers kind of reflect what I initially kind of found with players, like, so it doesn't seem like that much. So it does sort of seem to be like particular games or leagues perhaps. But I mean, Matt, that obviously Call of Duty team was significantly higher than anyone else I've ever talked to. So I wonder if it's like a Call of Duty thing even, But anyway, the idea, right? So caffeine does enhance cognitive performance. So there's no doubt about that at all. But the problem is that sometimes people use it too much and too late in the day. So, and sometimes people use it as a compensatory mechanism because they're sleepy. So the thing to be aware of is it's okay to use caffeine, just don't use too much too late in the day, and just keep in mind that sleep is always going to be better, like having a healthy sleep is always going to be better than relying on caffeine to make up the difference. So use it when you need it to get more out of it is the other thing I often say to people as well.
Yeah, and I think is a good place to start for most people, right? But understand that everyone metabolizes caffeine a little differently, so there's going to be individual differences here. And I think it's also if you do decide that you want to continue to use caffeine, it's even a good idea to understand how well you metabolize it by taking it at various times, so you understand your own what we call pharmacokinetics or metabolism of caffeine. So you can make better decisions about how you optimize it. Reed made a good point. This is definitely a biased sample size here, right? You guys are all here, trying to learn more about your health. Of course, I feel like there is definitely less maybe caffeine users in here than the general gaming public, but it's still good to understand that, because some people don't make the connection between caffeine and health anyways. But that's a good point to make.
I do love the idea though, Matt, what you're saying there. Like, I would 100% experiment with caffeine to kind of find the best fit for the individual. That's a really good point.
There's another question here, if you don't mind.
Sure.
The world champion Magnus Carlsen for chess, he switched to chocolate milk from sugary orange juice for longer matches, but do you know if that would impact sleep any differently? In terms of the carb consumption?
In terms of the what, sorry?
Maybe like the difference in sugar and carb consumption?
Well, we'll put it this way. I mean, I'm like, assuming that he's just playing during the day. I mean, I wouldn't probably have like a liter of chocolate milk right before bed, right? Not just because you're going to have to go to the toilet during the night, but the high sugar content can have an impact on the sleep. But if you're consuming it, during the day, and it's like a moderate amount, then it won't have any impact on sleep. But if you consume massive amounts of sugar or carbs right before bed, probably not the most helpful thing to do.
Got it. I'm sure we can get a little more in depth of that question, Reed, if you want to post it in the Reddit, because he was asking about the chess champion. But I'm sure we can get into nuance later on. But here, we'll talk about tech next, guys. This is I think a really important one. So
this is interesting, right? So like tech and the light from screens gets a really bad rap in the media. I think most people have kind of read somewhere, how tech destroys sleep.
I'll show an example here.
But what's that?
Just me looking at the screens.
So the thing is, right, is that there's the light from screens only has a fairly minimal effect on sleep. But the problem is that people actually tend to just use tech for way later than what they should. So, for example, let's say that my body clock was saying, oh, well, like I could probably fall asleep about 10 o'clock. But I'm reading the news or I'm watching an episode, so I just push it to like 10:30 or 11. But I still have to get up at 7 in the morning. So instantly I've just lost half an hour or an hour because I was using the tech for longer. So the idea being is that tech isn't that bad, really, as long as it's not too interactive. Like more passive tech use is probably has less of an impact. But you just don't want to let it eat into your sleep pattern. That's the main thing. So as long as you're disciplined in terms of keeping like a consistent kind of bedtime when your body clock says it's time to go to sleep, well, then tech's probably okay. There are some individual differences to light exposure, I should say that. So some research does suggest that some individuals may be more sensitive to light, but generally speaking, it has fairly minimal effect.
So I actually wanted to talk to you about this because I believe I read or listened to a study about how if you are inside and not exposed to as much light throughout the day, your melatonin sensitivity will decrease, right? So that might affect, gamers who are, historically and what we know to be inside a lot. Maybe the larger lights are not on and maybe they're in a darker environment in the room. So those of you guys that maybe are in a dark room for a majority of the day, then for you, tech might be a larger risk factor outside of this issue of, just eating into your sleep with a more active tech use. That's just something that I was thinking about when you had spoken about it previously.
It's a fair point to make. And I think what it sort of demonstrates, right, is that there's heaps of room for really interesting research, because that would be really interesting to know, wouldn't it, from a scientific perspective, if that were the case. But it is, like I said, I have to look
that up because I think there was a study that was done on the actual melatonin sensitivity differences of individuals in darker environments.
Yeah, I mean, you actually make another good point though, Matt, and that is about, getting light exposure, right? So decreasing light exposure in the evening is a good thing, generally, right? Just the screens, like the light from the screens just isn't much light. But getting light in the morning is something we'll talk about after, and that's something I would definitely recommend to people. All right, on to the next one, I think.
All right, guys.
Right, so social jet lag. So this is like a really common problem. I see this like with the Rocket League team that I work with at the moment. Like this is probably the biggest problem. So this is where people have irregular sleep patterns, right, which almost simulates being jet lagged. So when people have irregular sleep patterns where sometimes they go to sleep one night at this time and they sleep into a certain time, but the next day it's like, oh, I'm going to try jump over here. It creates this kind of irregularity in terms of sleep scheduling. And the research is interesting. So it sort of shows that in the long term, when you kind of average everything out, you probably get about the same amount of sleep although in the short term you can experience acute sleep loss with an irregular sleep schedule. But sleep quality is definitely worse. So the idea here, and this is something that I encourage everyone to do, is try and, as much as humanly possible, have a consistent sleep schedule so that you can actually reduce the impact or the risk of this simulated jet lag. So that's kind of why it's called social jet lag, because it's, like I said, it's almost a simulation of traveling, across time zones.
So when you say consistent schedule, what do you mean? What is? Can you elaborate or clarify that for everyone?
The sleep schedule?
Yeah, for having a consistent schedule.
Yeah, so it just basically just means having like a consistent wake-up time and a fairly consistent bedtime. So consistent wake-up time is more important than a consistent sleep time, because that acts like an anchor for the rest of your sleep pattern. But, obviously, as much as humanly possible, having a consistent sleep time as well will just increase the chances of getting the best sleep that you possibly can.
Exactly. All right. So social jet lag, guys. I think this is definitely a really important thing to understand, because during the weekend, all gamers want to do is, guess what? No more school. I'm just going to sleep all the way in.
Yeah,
And, I think it's hard, right? Because there's definitely social pressures in that, hey, maybe all of your friends are going to be doing it. Well, how is it going to affect me in the short term and long term? And I think it just begs the question, well, how important is the competition for you, or how important is performance for you, right? Because, if it's just a social thing, to me, even sometimes I think there's the benefit of having this social, like weekly social environment with your friends. And, it's always, while from the health perspective, it might be, hey, it will temporarily affect your sleep negatively. From the social perspective or mental health perspective, it might be beneficial. And we kind of just have to weigh that out, right? Unless you are this top level competitor, then it really makes sense for us to hone in on all these really specific details of social jet lag and how that might impact us on, pre-match days or training days. But, what are your thoughts about that, Daniel?
Which bit? Sorry, specifically. Sorry, Matt.
Just about having to strictly stick to this even on the weekends when gamers might be spending time with their friends.
Yeah, totally. So the weekend is the classic example, right? So people have restricted sleep patterns during the week, and then on weekends they sleep in, and that's literally what we were just looking at, was an example of that. Mm-hmm. And it's a balance, isn't it? Like I do say to a lot of my clients that I work with, I'm not trying to make their lives boring or anything like that, but you're just trying to create some sort of balance where, you are, to some degree, at least prioritizing sleep a little bit. I understand that, people aren't going to have the perfect sleep patterns, but certainly you can improve it and get more out of your sleep, and that's the balance, I suppose, I kind of come to a lot with people. Got it. All right.
We're almost there, guys. We're almost to the interventions or the things that we can do to actually establish. But we want to definitely talk about this other risk factor that was in the study that he did.
Pre-comp worry. Actually, who can relate to this? So it was about 50% of people in our studies that reported that they actually got worried and had poor sleep the night before a match. Who can relate to that? So another bit of research that we did, I suppose, was looking at, they were worried about match day performance and their place in the team, and then future contracts and that sort of thing. Because obviously, there are implications to performance. So those were clear worries that people experienced. But I was just interested about who can relate to that. Yeah.
We got a straight up, yeah. Yep.
And what? And just out of curiosity, I mean, if people don't mind, I mean, they might not want to, but what sort of things do they think about the night before a match? Like, what is on their mind? What keeps them awake? What are they thinking about?
We'll give them time to respond.
But
so maybe I'll offer some of mine, because I competed a little bit, and I'm always worrying about Will I remember how to make the appropriate decisions given some of my mental flowchart things? Because I was the in-game leader for my Counter-Strike team. So I would prep beforehand. I would scout the enemy team. I would identify their habits and patterns. And then I was always worried whether I'd be able to recognize that in the heat of the moment in the game to be able to make, better calls. That's definitely a worry or anxiety that I had. And just, if I would do well, right?
Yeah, sure.
So we have, they can relate. Same with exams, like actual tests.
Yeah, totally. It's exactly the same. Yeah.
Yeah, and one of them also says that, it happened a lot more when they were younger, but less so as they became more mature.
Okay. Yeah, sure.
And this guy, just so that you know, Reed, he's like an ex-professional for this game called Crossfire, and now he's switching over to Reed. If you don't mind me kind of telling you the backstory, but he wants to become or is aspiring to swap to Counter-Strike now. So he actually has a really cool story, and I'd love to have him on eventually, but that's another time. But yeah, why don't we get to the recipe, maybe the recipe of sleeping well, because I think we built up enough of a foundation for you guys that you guys might now understand a lot more about what is sleep, what's architecture, what's the body clock, what's sleep drive, and then of course all of the current studies, as it relates to gamers. So yeah, let's get into the ingredients.
So to sleep well, so there's 3 different things to think about. There's having a high sleep drive, correct sleep timing, and feeling relaxed. So really coming back to those sleep processes that we talked about right at the start. And I know that's the boring stuff, and I know that people don't like hearing about that stuff. But it's just necessary to actually understand why you actually do the things that you do to try and improve your sleep. And then, of course, the one at the end being relaxed, because, of course, we, as we just talked about, when people are feeling anxious or worried or frustrated, they do find it very, very difficult to get off to sleep or get back to sleep during the night. Right, so let's jump into it. So reduce sleep drive, which basically just means that people aren't sleepy enough to go to sleep when they want to. So some people, are just not active enough during the day, right? So the thing to sort of be mindful of is that when people are active during the day, it increases their sleep pressure, so that when at nighttime they have really good sleep quality and they get to sleep quickly. But when they're inactive, that sleep drive is lower. Napping too long. So I've actually worked with a few players who have been having like huge naps during the day, like massive naps. And as soon as you nap, your sleep pressure starts to go down. And when you wake up, it starts to build up again. But when you go to sleep at the same time, it's not as high as what it usually would be. Oversleeping, so that's the social jet lag. That's where people sleep in too long. Or the same thing, too much time spent in bed overnight. Caffeine and other stimulants. So caffeine, for example, actually blocks adenosine from building up in the brain like it should. So that's kind of why we talk about not having too much caffeine too late in the day. And then I think it was it Reed who was saying about the chess guy, Grandmaster, or whatever it was, and the diet of high sugar foods. So yeah, I mean, obviously having a diet that's too much, that's not kind of moderated, I suppose, can also have an effect on sleep as well. Drawing out adenosine, blocking the transmitter, yeah. So the way to kind of, I suppose, try and increase your sleep drive is just the reverse, right? So increasing daytime activity. So this is something that Matt and I have talked to a few players about. A lot of players, I found, they wake up and then they just jump straight on their computer. They might get something to eat and then they just jump straight on their computer. And then they might scrim, or they might just muck around for however long, and and that can take up a lot of their time during the day. So actually trying to do something before you do that, like something physical, something active, can be really helpful. The more, up until a limit, right? This is not going to apply to anyone here, I don't think. But more exercise, the better at the end of the day, really. But overtraining is something that elite athletes can do sometimes, but I don't think that's a risk factor for anyone but an elite athlete. Avoiding daytime naps. So some napping can be helpful, it depends on the person, depends on the situation. But generally speaking, I would sort of suggest trying to reduce naps as much as possible, because it just means at night time that you're going to have better quality and longer sleep as well. And that if you can get more of your sleep in that major sleep period, the better. Getting out of bed if you can't sleep, everyone hates doing that, right? But if you actually do get into bed and you can't sleep, it's actually better to get out of bed and then go back to bed later when you're feeling sleepy, so that you don't develop a negative association between the bedroom environment and being awake, which is what can happen with insomnia. Reducing stimulant use, obviously, so not, as we talked about with caffeine, and making sure that you do have that consistent wake-up time and not spending too long in bed overnight.
I would love to have everyone understand this. I just want to highlight this one again, because I think this is so common, right? When we can't sleep, we force ourselves to stay in bed, and oftentimes what happens? What happens with your thoughts? Do you guys think more calmly, or do you guys think more, do you guys panic a little bit? And, I've done this many times, right? Especially when I was younger. I avoided looking at the clock, right? That's at least something that I would do, so that I wouldn't know the time. But I would randomly just decide to do it, and it would make me more anxious. And if you guys remember, the third thing was busy mind. That is, I think, something that happens, when we stay in bed and worry and worry and worry. But I've definitely have done this, and I talked about this with Daniel before, but I get up and I stretch, or I even write in my journal now about, just so that I could, get some thoughts out of the way. That's something that I felt has been very helpful for me. Of course, I think it's really important. You don't turn on all your lights and get up. You still keep lighting pretty dim, right? You want to stretch in some darkness, or you want to write with some dim lighting in your journal. But that's at least what I do. I know you just said you stretch, but what else do you do? Do you have any other strategies for if you?
It's a very. So the parameters are, as long as it's in dim light and it's relaxing, then that's fine. So I'm exactly the same as you, Matt. Like, I actually just stretch because it's just really mild. You're not being physically active at that time, so you're not waking yourself up doing too much. And for me personally, like within 15, 20 minutes of just stretching on the carpet in the lounge room, I'll go back to bed and I'm out. So I find that really helpful.
Awesome.
Now this is the body clock. This is the one that I suppose I probably think is most relevant to almost all players. So the body clock disturbances, right? So causes being that social jet lag, so the irregular rising and bedtimes, lack of daytime structure. So you can hear my dog barking. Sorry about that. Lack of daytime structure. So some people they don't have anchors for their day. And not getting enough light upon waking is probably the biggest one that I can suggest to people, and we'll talk about that under solutions. Too much caffeine, so caffeine can also mess with your body clock as well. Too much tech and pushing it later and later and later. And then, of course, jet lag, but that's not really much of a problem at the moment. Now, in terms of what to do about your body clock, right? So as we talked about earlier, like that regular sleep schedule, particularly the rise time is just critical, and getting light exposure when you wake up. So this is something that I really, really would strongly recommend. And this is what I do, right? So as soon as I get up, so I get up really early. I'm up about 5:30 in the morning. And I jump into bed, take the dog for a walk for an hour, so I get exercise and I get light exposure at the same time. And I do that every single morning. And what it does is it resets my body clock so that the next night I get to sleep consistently at the same time. So light regulates melatonin, which is released by the body clock. So that's why it's so critical. It's got nothing to do with, some people sort of say, is it like, is it about like vitamin D and going through your skin? It's actually about light going through your retina and suppressing melatonin. So for people who have a delayed body clock, and they actually and they want to move earlier. So melatonin and bright light therapy are the recommended treatments for that problem. You really have to go and see like a professional to kind of do that, just to be kind of guided through the process. But I like to just mention those just so that people have a bit of an idea about what to ask for when they actually do seek professional help for that kind of problem. Yeah, when people are trying to say what Matt's drawn, that's fantastic. So if you're trying to move, let's say you were the blue line, but you want to move back to the black line and you want an earlier body clock, that's bright light therapy and melatonin.
All right.
For some teams, I actually suggest doing things as a team at different times of the day as well to try and create that structure in your day. That was actually suggested by a team that we worked with in the US, and I thought it was a wonderful idea. And so that's actually something that I've started recommending as well.
Yep. I think this is underrated in its ability to help everyone normalize their sleep and also just their schedule, right? Everything that you do throughout the day is a signal or info for your body and your body clock so that it regulates it based off that. You can kind of think of your body clock in that way, with light being by far the most important. I think it's called the Zeitgeber, right? Zeitgeber.
Zeitgeber, yeah. So in German it means time giver, yeah.
There's another good question from Reed. He says, how do you differentiate a 15-minute nap from 10 to 15 minutes of resting your eyes? And he takes naps a lot, but are they even naps?
Oh, yeah, so they may not be. So it depends. If you have no memory, then I would suggest you were asleep. But it is really hard to tell when you've actually been dipping in and out of light sleep. So, I talk to a lot of people, particularly a lot of older people who fall asleep on the couch, and their partner might say, "Oh, you were asleep," and they were like, "No, I wasn't. Don't be stupid." But you could hear their breathing change. Their eyes are closed. They're clearly asleep. But when you go into the light stages of sleep, when you come out of the light stages of sleep, sometimes you just don't notice that you've actually been asleep. So that's the same with napping. Yeah.
So we're almost done, guys, and then you guys can submit all of your questions into the Reddit. This is the last thing, right? Remember, there's 3. We have our sleep drive that we're addressing. We have our body clock that we're addressing, and then of course the busy mind.
Right. So busy mind. So this is, as we talked about before, people worrying before competition. So, or ruminating about performance after a match. That's something else that I'd love to look at one day. How do people cope with a loss, and does that affect their sleep afterwards? Mental health issues like depression, anxiety, and stress can also obviously cause a busy mind. Unhelpful beliefs about sleep. So some people get, obviously they get really worried about the fact they're not sleeping particularly well. Clock watching actually amplifies worry. Yep. So I certainly would suggest not doing that. Sudden withdrawal from meds and caffeine, and once again other stimulants. Some people are very sensitive to caffeine, and they can actually experience anxiety symptoms because of it.
Yep.
So the solutions being winding down before bed and having a regular bedtime routine, right? So some people do heaps right up until bed. I wouldn't suggest doing that. You kind of want to let your body and brain start to relax increasingly as you get closer and closer to bed. Only going to bed when sleepy. So sometimes people try and force sleep, and they actually try to go to sleep earlier than what they should, when you should be listening to your body and your brain, but when you should be going to sleep. But of course, if someone has a delayed sleep pattern and they want to move earlier, that's a different issue. Mindfulness is something that I would recommend everybody to look into. I think it's fantastic. And there's lots of guided stuff out there as well that people can download for free. That can give you a great introduction to mindfulness. And then, of course, work-life balance is always going to be helpful. And for people who do experience some kind of sort of difficulty in managing a busy mind, or maybe have mental health kind of experiences, then cognitive therapy and getting professional help can be quite helpful for that as well.
Exactly.
So the whole point is about trying to bring down all of the tension and the busy mind that people can experience at night, and just trying to be as relaxed as possible.
Exactly.
Now, this is the one thing that's really funny. I always like to mention this, right? We talk about sleep, we talk about how important it is, we talk about the impact of sleep loss and all that sort of stuff. But I don't want people to stress about it, because the more that people stress about their sleep, the worse they sleep. Okay, so the idea is balance. So prioritizing healthy sleep habits, but not to the point where it becomes an obsession or a preoccupation. And that's it.
That is all, guys. So everyone, I want to thank you guys all, first off for coming in here. Thank Daniel for taking the time to do this. We want to answer a lot of these questions, and we're going to actually answer a few live. But before we do that, you guys can all hop over, load up the Reddit AMA. Daniel and Kevin and all of us will be answering questions. Before we actually get into it, I need you guys to do something for me. I'm going to give you guys a link. I'm going to post it in the chat. If you guys can just do us a favor and retweet this. This is a study that Daniel did that he just recently published. So, and Daniel, if you want to just kind of highlight what the study was, maybe that can help.
Yeah, so it was the one with the 17 pros from Australia, the US, and Korea. So we literally only published it, I think, about 3 weeks ago. And the more exposure, the better. So that was where we looked at sleep characteristics and the mood of players from those countries. So it was actually the first study ever to use objective sleep measures and measure the sleep of esports players. So yeah, we were really excited to publish it, and we're going to use that as a bit of a springboard to do heaps of more research, like the intervention study that I talked about. And then some other ones as well. So yeah, the more exposure, the better. If people can retweet it, that would be wonderful.
Yeah. So hey, Ralex, thank you so much. We just got a donation of $20 going straight to Daniel for providing us with all this great information.
Thanks, man.
And guys, we're gonna try to get to 1 to 2, maybe 3 questions, and then we're gonna hop into the AMA. You guys can ask the more in-depth questions. We definitely want to get to some of you guys' initial thoughts first. So we have Reed. Would that mean you should focus when initially fixing your rhythm on waking up earlier rather than going to bed earlier? Sort of a bottom-up approach.
That's correct. Yeah. So it's hard to go into detail about someone shifting their body clock, because there's a bit of a process around it. But the answer is yes. The short answer is yes to that. So you, in a nutshell, gradually try and wake up earlier and earlier and earlier with exposure to bright light. But like I said, best guided by a professional if possible. If that makes sense. I hope that, I know it's not the ideal answer, but it's in a nutshell. That's probably the best I can do, because it's a bit of a long answer otherwise.
Yeah, and guys, we're going to make sure that the Voltaic community has access to this VOD, so you guys can reference it at any time. So maybe we'll create a separate channel that only Voltaic users will have access to. So we'll work that out with Cine. But we have also from David Hernandez, any tips for better sleep quality for athletes? It's kind of a general question, but if you want to get athletes? To it, for athletes, and maybe David, what kind of athlete are you?
Yeah, actually, that's an interesting question. Yeah.
And we'll just wait for his response.
So the one, for this is probably less relevant for athletes, but because it's just the nature of being an athlete. But the one tried and tested is exercise. So exercise is fantastic for sleep quality, and that sleep regularity is excellent for sleep quality. Keep in mind that your brain does create its own homeostasis, and it does do a very good job of regulating the sleep architecture. So your different stages of sleep that you go into. So unless you disturb that, it does do a really good job of making sure you get the kind of sleep that you need, unless there's something that disrupts it. So it's more about trying to, I suppose, remove things that disrupt your sleep quality. Also knowing that, like I said, that regularity and exercise can be particularly good for good sleep quality.
So he's a power lifter. I don't know if that changes your response at all, but I think it makes total sense. When you do more, your natural sleep architecture will modify itself, whether it be a little more deep sleep, a little more stage 2 sleep for some motor adaptation changes that will allow you to, make the associated gains that you need.
So for him, because he's an actual powerlifter, probably the other thing to be aware of is overtraining. So because that can obviously impact sleep quality. So there's a threshold where if you go past that threshold, it actually has a negative effect on sleep quality for training, and it only really applies to genuine athletes, if that makes sense.
Yep.
So, for example, during like periods of intense training leading up to a competition, that can be a bit of a risky time for overtraining. So it's about, I suppose, being aware of if you're reaching that overtraining threshold, and what it can do to your sleep as well particularly during those intense periods of training. Yeah. There's actually. Sorry.
No. Go on. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, we could link in that other article of mine about sleep interventions for traditional sports as well. We could link that in somewhere as probably.
Sure.
That might be interesting for some people to read about, yeah.
We also have another question, and maybe we'll make these the last two questions because we want to get into the text-based ones. You also need... This guy has also heard that more sleep is needed for fat loss, which doesn't make sense to him. Is that true?
So really interesting. So it was a pretty contentious kind of issue in the literature for quite a while. The link between sleep loss and weight gain, and it's only probably more recently in the last couple of years that more and more research has kind of come out suggesting that, actually, getting adequate sleep is actually quite good for maintaining a healthy body weight, and that sleep loss can link in, is a risk factor for weight gain. So one of the things to be aware of is that sleep does help to regulate different chemicals, sort of, I suppose, related to eating behavior. So things like ghrelin and leptin. And so, for example, people that experience sleep loss do experience like increased cravings for like high sugar, high fat foods, for example. And so, people can be more predisposed to eating those foods when they're experiencing sleep loss. So it's just easier to kind of manage those cravings, for example, when you're adequately, when your sleep need is being met. Yeah.
You said increased ghrelin and leptin, right?
That regulates ghrelin and leptin.
Regulates them. Got it. Okay, and then the last question is, what types of exercises would be the most beneficial for sleep, and how long would the target amount be? I think this is
what was the second part of the question? Sorry.
How long would the target amount be? I like this question a lot. For exercise.
For exercise?
Yeah.
Yeah. Actually, it's pretty broad, right? So there's a fair bit of research on this, but the findings are fairly kind of broad. I would say, as a general rule of thumb, like any exercise is good. The more, the better, up to the point of overtraining, right? But like I said, that's only a problem for athletes, like elite athletes. And a mixture of aerobic and sort of non-aerobic exercise is fine. The timing of exercise has been investigated as well. So exercise, this is for an average person, by the way, like who's got an average sleep schedule. Exercise kind of in the later afternoon, early evening is probably particularly helpful. But to be honest, I mean, research aside, it's just about doing what you can do. Like because people have lives, sometimes people say, well, I can't exercise at, that time. And it's like, that's fine. Just do whatever you can do, and it's better than nothing.
Yep.
So that's I take a very general kind of approach to exercise when it comes to sleep.
Yeah,
you just have to make it fit in your life.
Exactly. And I think that's definitely the approach that we should take for a lot of things, right? It has to be individualized, right? How long is the target amount? Well, it depends on your current level of conditioning, right? If we said 60 minutes for someone, that might be normal within their capacity. But for gamers, it's definitely a lot less in terms of what we have seen when we do this analysis of how often are gamers exercising or how often are gamers doing different types of exercises. Just make the decision based on what you're currently doing and just do a little more, a little more every day or a little more off of your baseline if you feel like you're not getting, as great sleep. I just think that's generally the approach that we should take. So
yeah, make it work. That's the general rule of thumb. Yeah.
All right, guys. Well, hey, thank you all so much. This definitely extended a little further than we wanted to, but we wanted to get as deep, as possible with this topic, right?
Yeah.
Because sleep is so important, and there's definitely a lot more nuance to sleep, and how other things like exercise, nutrition, your mentality, your mindset can impact it. And if you guys have those questions, go ahead and hop over to the Reddit. We'll be present for another hour and a half to be answering those questions. Thank you guys all so much. And if you guys could just do us one more favor, if you learned one thing today, do us a favor, tag any of us and tweet it out and say, this is what I learned. This is why it's important. Because when you guys repeat things and when you guys highlight some of the things that you learn, it actually better helps you understand the knowledge. So if you guys can do that, that'll also be very helpful for us and really helpful for the entire community. So tweet out what you guys learned, tag us in it, and also everyone just, do your claps for Daniel for taking the time to do this, for waking up early, probably getting his dog really antsy about not walking.
No, we went for a walk. It was just at 5 o'clock.
Oh, good. Okay. So he's all the way in Perth, Australia, and I'm here in Los Angeles, and we made this work. And I'm so glad we did. This will all be hopefully saved in a VOD for the Voltaic community, and likely for some other things as well. But thank you guys all again, and we'll see you guys in the Reddit.
Yeah, thanks very much, everyone. I love doing this sort of stuff, even if it's like one or two things that everyone gets to learn from doing this sort of stuff.